Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine. I've been working on AI governance project at CERI over the summer. Specifically, I've been supervised by CERI, and I've been looking at understanding applications of AI to government surveillance. So I'll start by giving a little bit of a background and trying to motivate why this is an interesting question to work on. I'll chat a little bit about my methodology. I'll talk you through my findings and then give you like a quick summary of my results so far. Before I start, I should really be clear about what I mean by the words I'm using. Surveillance, I think, is capturing the common sense meaning of the word and looking at the focus, systematic and routine attention to detail, influence, management, protection, or direction. And by AI surveillance, I just mean the use of surveillance technologies which involve applications of artificial intelligence. So examples you might already be familiar with are things like facial recognition or predictive policing, where we get AI models with some objective, and we're optimizing them to do something that's helpful to us. Okay, so why even work on this? I think for starters, there's a good case for expecting increasing AI surveillance. There's a cluster of AI-specific reasons and then some state-specific reasons. So for the AI side of things, AI capabilities have been increasing over time, and particularly rapidly in the last 5 or 10 years. Models are just getting better and better at optimizing for what their objective is. Secondly, we've also seen diminishing costs of data collection and data storage. This makes running models and training models cheaper and makes them more cost-effective at achieving their objectives. So putting these things together, I'd expect to see more use of AI models over time. On the state-specific side of things, states in general are incentivized to surveil their citizens, which would suggest that you'd see more state surveillance where possible. So putting these two things together, I'd expect from like a purely theoretical background, that you see more AI surveillance over time. And it turns out the empirical evidence supports this. So AI surveillance went from being quite a niche thing back when it was quite expensive and not particularly good, to now being relatively widespread, like lots of countries across the world do use some forms of AI surveillance. But even if this was the case, even growing this argument, why can, right? So I think there are two major ways that AI surveillance can go wrong. Firstly, we have AI misalignment. And by this, I mean systems which fail to do what the designers want them to do. It's just pretty hard to specify the goal that we actually mean and get systems to do it. So I think a nice example here is, again, predictive policing. What we want out of predictive policing is a system which predicts who will commit crimes. And what we tend to get is a system which predicts who's going to get caught doing crimes. And the distinction is important. I know this is a separate issue from how effective AI systems are. Systems can be very effective at their goals and still not pursue the goals we want them to do. And getting systems to do exactly what we want them to do and no more is like a really hard technical problem. Secondly, even if systems do what we want, we have a problem of human misuse. For one thing, designers might have goals we don't agree with. So you can think about, for example, social media surveillance in authoritarian states for this. So we have some like really great systems for, great in the technical sense, for monitoring social media and picking up on signs of dissent, and identifying people who are unhappy about regimes. This works technically very well. Normatively, lots of people are quite unhappy about this. State surveillance also has a tendency to centralize power in the hands of the state, which again can go wrong if we think the state is doing things that are not good for citizens. And lastly, it can have a corrosive effect on values and some things we find important. So if you care about democracy, for example, or free speech, you might be worried about increasing social media surveillance in authoritarian states, insofar as it limits these things. So AI surveillance, I think, is a technical problem. It has political consequences, and I think it's important to analyze it from this kind of background and think about what we can do to mitigate the harms. So I guess that's the case for AI surveillance in general being important. Why prediction specifically is important? Again, I have 3 reasons. So I think prediction helps us know where and who we should be paying attention to. If we have a sense of which states we think are likely to implement surveillance in the near term, or are much less likely to implement surveillance, we can decide where we want to focus our attention and what we should be keeping track of. Prediction can help remedy lack of transparency. So authoritarian states are famously not particularly public with what they're doing with their scary, oppressive regimes. And prediction can be a useful tool, not a perfect tool, but a useful tool in remedying this. So if we know that states are very similar to others which do implement AI surveillance, and we have some good evidence to think that the ways in which they're similar are relevant for the question of whether they'll use AI surveillance, then we have some evidence to suggest that these states may implement surveillance. So this helps us get around the problems of transparency of authoritarian states. Lastly, I think it's better to establish norms and policies before they become a live issue. So AI surveillance, I claim, is currently a problem. But even if you don't buy this and you just think it might be an issue in the next 5 years, I think it's more useful to think about the kinds of worlds we want to live in now and the ways we think we should govern surveillance now before it becomes like a hot topic. And prediction can help us with this because we know which kind of states and what kind of use cases we should be thinking about. Cool. Hopefully I've convinced you. So my methodology for thinking about AI surveillance is like a 3-part process. I began by generating possible predictors. So I did this by doing a literature review. I looked at surveillance studies. I contrasted it with the long-termist literature and also the technical literature on surveillance. And I've also looked at historical case studies. So I looked at technologies which were used by states to gather information or increase their control of their citizens, which had some misuse risk and diminishing marginal costs, so they could be scaled up. And the idea here was that by looking at the things that are relevant to the adoption of these technologies in the past, I could think about how these factors might generalize to adopting similar technologies, surveillance technologies in the future. Once I had my cluster of possible predictors, I tested them. I found a nice data set, I got some stats from it, and I built some models for predicting surveillance, which I then evaluated their predictive power and goodness of fit of. So, takeaways from the literature review. So, surveillance studies, it's an interdisciplinary field. Lots of its practitioners study law, philosophy, and sociology, and it has a much more normative than empirical focus. I think the starting assumption of surveillance studies is that there's an absolute trade-off between the benefits surveillance brings, so security normally, and the other value. So usually people talk about privacy here, which I guess is the intuitive case. Also, scholars reference autonomy and transparency of the state. So starting from this point, surveillance studies ask us which trade-offs we should accept. There's more of a focus of like the normative claim here and less focus on empirically evaluating the effect of surveillance on these values. Long-term literature is pretty different. It's motivated by high-impact events, hence the focus on existential and global catastrophic risks, and more integrated with the technical literature than surveillance studies. And I think because of this, it rejects this sort of a starting assumption of the surveillance studies literature. The insight here, I think, is that increasing technical capabilities means these trade-offs are no longer absolute. We have nice technical solutions that can give us more about other values like privacy or transparency without sacrificing any security. So a nice example here, which Ben Garfinkel talks about, is set search. So suppose the toy example is, suppose we know a crime's been committed at 3 different locations and we think it's the same person. To find a list of suspects, we can look at cell phone masts in the area and get a list of phones which were using them at the appropriate time. And then we can look at the intersection of these 3 sets, and that would be our list of suspects. It would be people at all 3 crime scenes. In the past, this had to be done on fully unencrypted data, so anyone in any of the 3 sets. We've got better using cryptography. We've got better differential privacy now, and this means we can perform this operation only decrypting data which is in the intersection of all 3 sets. So we get gains to privacy for the people not affected without sacrificing the effectiveness of this method of identifying criminals. Cool. So from my literature review and from my case studies, I generated some possible predictors, which I think you can cluster into like 4 main groups. We have like public perception, the legal context, the political context, and the economic context. So public perception, you can split down to the perception of risk in general. So I think most saliently terrorism risk and crime risks seems to have played a big effect in the adoption of similar technologies in the past. Equally, and I think quite intuitively, the perception of technology seems to play a big effect. So people are worried about privacy. This makes them less likely to be pro that using this technology. If they believe it's effective, they're more likely to support it. Outside of the perception cluster, the legal precedent seems to really matter. So Britain, for example, doesn't have a constitution and doesn't have any kind of constitutional right to privacy. And I think this was an important factor in why CCTV was implemented far more quickly in Britain than in America. Influenced by the political context and the economic incentives. So public participation in technology policy seems to affect the speed at which new technologies are adopted and also their regulation, so government preferences over policy, and economic incentives also matter. Large private companies stand to benefit from wide-scale adoption of technologies because usually they're the ones making the models. So governments which are more pro-privatization or more influenced by lobbying seem to adopt surveillance technologies offered by these companies more quickly. All right, so I had my cluster of predictors and I moved on to try and analyze some data to see if any of these actually held up. So my starting point was Felsheim's AI surveillance index, which measures the presence of 4 different kinds of AI surveillance systems. So firstly, he looks at safe city systems, which are systems with tracking devices, video cameras, and other surveillance technologies to enhance police capabilities. If you've heard of the city brain systems in China, this is like an example that I think he's talking about. He also looks at the presence of facial recognition systems, the presence of smart policing, which includes things like predictive policing, and the presence of social media surveillance. I want to emphasize the presence thing here. So one major limitation of the work I did was that I was only looking at whether or not surveillance technologies were used, not the extent to which they were used or the purpose for which they were used. It'd be interesting to look more at this in the future, but I think this, like for now, just like, caveat, bear in mind, I've got this like binary distinction between using and not using, and this makes my results less fine-grained. Before I get to my results, to the Null results, stuff which did not turn out to be true, unfortunately. Firstly, I found there wasn't enough evidence to claim that terrorism risk or geopolitical alliances significantly affected government adoption of AI surveillance. This was like counterintuitive to me. I would have guessed the terrorism risk would have played a big effect in whether governments thought this was like worth adopting. Also for geopolitical alliances. So I operationalized this by looking at regime area and also by looking at China's Belt and Road Scheme, which is Chinese investment in other countries' infrastructure via conditional loans. So I looked to see whether involvement in this scheme had an effect on whether states were likely to adopt surveillance. And I also looked at whether just location affected this as like a rough proxy for like geopolitical alliances. And neither of these.
Catherine, sorry, I think you're out of time technically. So if you could wrap up soon.
No, sorry. Okay, sorry, I'm way slower in person. So those are my Null results. I also have some nice positive results. And this is basically the main takeaway. So it turns out that log GDP, Human Freedom Index, military expenditure, and the Democratic Index all have correlations with my different kinds of AI surveillance. You'll notice that none of these factors are correlated with all 4 kinds of AI surveillance, and the sign of the correlation varies across forms of AI surveillance. Turns out prediction is pretty hard, and a lot of the factors were kind of counterintuitive. But my best model was using military expenditure and Human Freedom Index score to predict social media surveillance. And I think this is like kind of helpful for understanding surveillance. So I'm over time. Thanks. Any questions?